What do you have against them?
Nothing. But as a rule, I don't really warm to their type.
I don't believe in types. I believe in people.
In some attempt to make this video essay seem vaguely relevant, since Downton Abbey finished airing in 2015. Wow, that does make you feel old. I'm going to talk about the latest cinematic excursion in the Downton Abbey franchise, which is Downton Abbey: A New Era, released earlier this year. I hope you caught it in cinemas. I did, unfortunately. And that clip that I just showed you is not from the film, but we will come back to it, I promise you. So, Downton Abbey: A New Era takes place in 1928 and involves two main plot lines. The first one, the main one, headed by Lady Mary Crawley Talbot, involves a Hollywood film crew coming to Downton to make a silent picture, only to discover in the course of making said picture that silent films are no longer profitable. They decide to make it a talkie instead, that is, a film with sound. But there's just one problem. Their beautiful leading lady, Myrna Dalgleish, has a very strong Cockney accent. What to do? Lady Mary reluctantly steps in to dub Myrna's dialogue with her cut-glass English accent, and the day is saved. And if this sounds in any way familiar to you, yes, is the plotline of Singin' in the Rain. Our secondary plotline involves those characters who couldn't be fitted into the first plotline, heading for a villa in the south of France. And among these characters is our friend Tom Branson, former chauffeur, former socialist, current Irishman, and kind of a member of the aristocracy now. Tom's role in Downton Abbey: A New Era is quite small, at least when you compare it to the first Downton Abbey film, in which, among other things, he saved King George V's life. In A New Era, we do see him frolicking on a beach in the south of France with his new wife, Lucy Smith, and we also get this line from his mother-in-law. Now, unfortunately, I can't show you a clip because the movie is so new, so you're just going to have to trust me on this one. I will show you the script here so you can see the line. And yeah, it is quite bad. So, at this point in Downton Abbey's life cycle as a cultural touchstone, you might be forgiven for thinking of the 2022 film, what with its villas in the south of France, its jazz parties and singing in the rain shenanigans, as pure escapism. Once upon a time, Downton Abbey might have been a series that attempted some cultural or historical commentary, and these days it is all spectacle, all entertainment. So you would be forgiven for thinking so, but then you get lines like these. And you are forced to confront the fact that Downton Abbey: A New Era, silly and frothy as it might be, is, like any piece of art in this world, saying something. So, what are you saying here, Julian Fellows? Are you saying that Tom Branson should be congratulated for escaping his Irish roots, or his socialist roots, or both? Is this supposed to be tongue-in-cheek? I think not, given the fact that the line goes entirely unexamined in the text, and given the framing. What's important here is Tom's triumph is what's being foregrounded, and this triumph has to do with his having married into the aristocracy for a second time. I'm outstanding in my field. I make video essays on Irish representation in media and on Irish media as well. So this mainly pertains to films and TV shows at the moment. My two previous videos were on Star Trek: The Next Generation and Harry Potter respectively. So if you're interested, you can check those out. I'll have links in the description. And in general, if you like this kind of content, I would love to see you click that subscribe button. And of course, give us an old like as well. If you want to get notified about my future videos, you can click the bell icon down below. At the moment, I'm planning to upload a new video once a month. This one took a bit longer just because, I mean, there was so much to discuss, as you see, with this length. Yeah, so, but in general, yeah, I plan to upload once a month, so thank you. Let's get into it. So, there has been a lot written about the tragedy of the English upper classes at the beginning of the 20th century. A dying breed, threatened first by such freak accidents as the sinking of the Titanic, then by war and Bolshevism, all while modernity creeps onto their sacred estates, enticing away their servants into shops, into factories, turning their townhouses into blocks of flats. Oh, the horror. Upstairs Downstairs, a TV series which aired during the 1970s, and which was the largest source of inspiration for Downton, mined a great part of its drama from this sense of tragedy. Upstairs Downstairs revolves around the lives of the aristocratic Bellamys and their servants, taking place in a London townhouse between the years of 1903 and 1930. In the course of its 5 series, we see Lady Bellamy dying on the Titanic, her daughter-in-law dying of Spanish flu, and her son committing suicide after losing his fortune in the stock market crash of 1929. One of the servants also commits suicide in the first season, and in general you have this sense of unease pervading the whole show.
You know, I like bells ringing late in dark corridors. One day, you know, if things go on as they have been, you might ring and no one would ever come. There'd be nobody there.
An unease, which I might add is conveyed a lot more subtly than in Downton Abbey.
I've told myself you're too far above me. But things are changing. When the war is over, the world won't be the same place as it was when it started.
Downton Abbey takes place during a similar time period as Upstairs Downstairs. Its 6 series span the years of 1912 to 1925. And it might be said then to have similar preoccupations as Upstairs Downstairs. Executive producer Gareth Neame and creator Julian Fellows have both described the show as depicting the tragedy of the upper classes. But if Downton is really about the dying of the light, why is the aristocracy alive and well by the end of its run, and indeed by the end of the 2022 film? Why does Downton itself, the estate, remain intact throughout all of this, uncorrupted by modernity? A tragedy usually begins with the hero in a place of prominence and ends with their fall due to some fatal flaw ingrained in their character. But what fatal flaw do the Crawleys have that results in their downfall? They treat their servants well, they grumble a bit about the changes brought on by modernity, but ultimately they accept these changes. They're not homophobic, at least not once they've adjusted to the idea of one of their footmen being gay. While Downton Abbey acknowledges that some cruel masters exist, and that some people treat their servants, or treat the help in general, worse than others, it emphasises that the Crawleys are not like this. For example, look at the Duke of Crowborough, who in the pilot episode of Downton Abbey snoops around the servants' quarters in order to get back letters that he wrote the footman Thomas during their brief dalliance.
And who will leave a greedy footman over the words of a duke? If you're not careful, you'll end up behind bars. I've got proof. You mean these?
So, time and time again throughout this series, we're reminded of the fact that the Crawleys see their servants as human. Like, we're supposed to be amazed that Lord Grantham is good friends with his valet, Mr. Bates, even though the two men fought together in the Boer War. We're supposed to marvel at the fact that the butler Carson has a father-daughter-like relationship with Lady Mary, when this is only natural since the man has been working at Downton for the better part of 2 decades by the time the show starts, and he's seen Mary, Edith and Sybil all grow up. Yet, while the Crawleys treat their servants with basic respect, there are certain boundaries that they won't cross. The only significant cross-class relationship that we see play out during the show is between Tom Branson and Lady Sybil Crawley, but there are 2 important caveats to this. Firstly, Branson as the chauffeur, which is a newly created role thanks to the recent invention of the motor car. He's kind of considered as separate to the rest of the downstairs staff, and he barely shares any scenes with them. And secondly, crucially, Branson is gradually assimilated into the English upper classes, so that his class identity and his nationality ultimately do not threaten the natural order of things. So, the Crawleys are really nice. They see their servants as family, as friends, They give up their home so that it can be used as a convalescent hospital during the First World War. They let Anna and Mr. Bates, after they've married, continue to work in Downton while they live separate to the estate in their own cottage. They lease Yew Tree Farm to Mr. Mason, even though he's considered too old, because they know that it means a lot to their assistant cook, Daisy. And of all the Crawleys, Lady Sybil Crawley is the nicest. She helps the housemaid Gwen get a job as a secretary in season 1. She forms a sort of friendship with her family's Irish chauffeur, shock horror, and pleads for this chauffeur when her father is about to fire him after he drove Sybil to this political rally that ended up getting rowdy, even though Sybil lied to Branson about where she was going and the whole thing was her fault anyway. But okay. And she once again ensures that Branson can keep his job after he confesses his feelings for her in season 2, by promising that she will not tell anyone.
I'm terribly flattered.
Don't say that.
Why not?
Because flattered is a word posh people use when they're getting ready to say no.
She is active in the struggle for women's rights, at least until such questions have to be put aside in favour of the war effort, which was true of many feminists of Sybil's class. And Sybil also begins work as a VAD, a voluntary aid detachment, in Downton Abbey's convalescent hospital. But by far the most noble and kind thing that Sybil does is the fact that she eventually, after years, after an entire world war, accepts Branson and agrees to elope with him. Only to then, in the course of said elopement, change her mind and decide that she wants her family's blessing instead. It's important to keep in mind here that Tom Branson has been waiting at Downton Abbey for years, ever since Sybil's rejection of him back in 1916. Season 2 ends in 1920. So all this time in Tom's native country in Ireland, the struggle has been ramping up for independence, and an entire uprising happens in 1916, which he misses. Now, this is in part an issue with the show's pacing and its need to draw out the drama of the Branson-Sybil relationship.
Jeffrey, we're in love! Love's not meant for me. Love's only meant for them folk upstairs.
But if we ignore this and just take it at face value, what we get here is a story in which an upper-class woman explicitly rejects a working-class man, and then he just waits around for her for 4 years. Even after Sybil starts to return Branson's feelings for her, she keeps dragging her feet over making a decision. And while it's realistic that she would be reluctant to defy her family, her reluctance just reaches this ridiculous point. She keeps coming into the garage to bother Branson. At some point you just want him to say, "What, Sybil? What? I'm actually in the middle of something here." Sybil has all the power in this dynamic. And when you add into that the colonial element, with his being Irish and her being English, the issue becomes even messier. Each delay that Sybil introduces into their elopement is a delay in Branson returning to his native country to help with the struggle for independence. But when he quite naturally shows his frustration at this, he's framed as the one in the wrong.
You're good at hiding your feelings, aren't you? All of you. Much better than we are.
Perhaps. But we do have feelings, and don't make the mistake of thinking we don't.
Lines like this one are also incredibly revealing because they get at the heart of Downton Abbey's ideology of individualism. By proposing to its audience the wild notion that upper-class people have feelings, a notion which no sane person would actually dispute, Downton Abbey stages the class struggle along individual lines rather than systemic lines, and therefore we get this focus on Branson's prejudice against Sybil rather than the way in which Sybil wields her privilege, even though we see an example of this in season 1, where she lies to Branson to get him to drive her to this political rally and ends up getting him in trouble. But this is never examined, and it's made even worse by the show's superficial depiction of Branson's socialist principles. For instance, in season 3, after he and Sybil have been married, we get this whole conflict where Branson is kicking up a fuss about wearing a morning coat, and he describes the morning coat as the uniform of oppression. And then on the rare occasions when Downton Abbey makes reference to points in socialist history, surprise, surprise, we get a focus on the individual cost. So in season 2, episode 5, for example, Branson tells Sybil that he's shocked about the Tsar and his family being shot, but that it was a sacrifice that had to be made for the good of the cause. And then he segues into talking about the sacrifice that Sybil will have to make by marrying him. Very smooth, Branson. And then again in season 3, episode 4 in 1920, Tom flees Ireland after helping burn down the castle at Drumgool, which doesn't exist, by the way, but that's fine. And tells the Crawleys that he was sorry for what he did, sorry for the individuals who lived there.
Standing there with their children, all of them in tears watching their home burn. I was sorry. I don't want their type to govern Ireland. I want a free state, but I was sorry.
And Tom only manages to evade arrest on this occasion because Lord Grantham, his father-in-law, happens to be chums with the Home Secretary and can pull some strings. And this is never addressed. Like, Lord Grantham wielding his privilege in this way is just, all right, Tom's fine with it, I guess, so we're all fine with it. Branson's nationalism actually gets more airtime in the show than his socialism, and we do see the writers of Downton Abbey making that vague attempt to understand Ireland's position that we've seen, you know, countless times before in English shows. But I would say that this attempt in Downton Abbey's case is particularly feeble. In season 2, Branson gives Sybil a little speech on the 1916 Rising, which is fine, I guess.
I lost a cousin in the Easter Rising last year. He was walking down North King Street one day and an English soldier saw him and shot him dead. When they asked why he was killed, the officer said, because he was probably a rebel.
So the story that Branson tells here about his cousin is quite accurate. But I find it interesting that given how Downton is so concerned with what happened to the Tsar and his family, and with the rich Anglo-Irish whose houses were burned down, it should ignore the abundance of heart-wrenching individual stories that we get from the 1916 Rising in favour of a fictional one. For instance, how about the fact that Francis Sheehy Skeffington, an Irish pacifist, was captured and shot by British forces after he was actively trying to prevent the looting that was taking place in the inner city of Dublin during the Rising. How about the fact that James Connolly, one of the leaders of the 1916 Rising, and also, as it happens, a socialist, which would have made him a perfect example for Branson to mention. How about the fact that he was tied to a chair when he faced the firing squad because he was too injured to stand at the time of his execution? How about the fact that Grace Gifford and Joseph Plunkett, latter of whom was also a leader of the 1916 Rising, got married shortly before his execution? I mean, this is romantic as well as tragic. You'd think that Downton would eat it right up. But we don't get a mention of any of these, individual tragedies. And to me, that signals that not only are Downton Abbey's politics rooted in individualism, but that individualism is incredibly one-sided. So ultimately, Tom Branson's nationalism is presented to us as juvenile. Part of the reason that he gets to stay at Downton throughout the war to wait for Sybil is because he has been exempted from army service due to a heart condition. And when he learns about this condition, Branson is really disappointed because he was planning to humiliate the British army by being called up and then refusing to serve. And so the next plan that he hatches is to pour a bucket of slop over the head of a visiting general at Downton Abbey. Yeah, that'll show him. And Branson doesn't even get to do that because all the other servants rush to stop him. Similarly, Tom's socialism is presented as something he has to grow out of. And so when later in the series, the school teacher, Miss Bunting, asks him if he's still a socialist, we get that line about seeing people rather than types. So Tom is now entrenched in the world of the English upper classes. And this is because the Crawleys have been nice enough to accept him as one of their own, despite his being Irish, despite his being a former socialist, despite his being a former chauffeur. So this transformation of Tom's character has some behind-the-scenes elements to it as well, which we should briefly mention. Jessica Brown Findlay, who played Sybil, wanted to leave the show, and so in season 3 they killed off her character by having her die in childbirth. And obviously Alan Leach, who played Branson, wanted to continue in the show, so they had to find a way to incorporate him into the story without Sybil. So Julian Fellows takes a look at Branson's character, at his origins, and says to himself, what am I going to do with this guy? Oh, I know. I'll make him into a success story. So Tom Branson not only continues to be accepted by the Crawleys after Sybil's death, but he actually becomes the financial agent of Downton Abbey. The Tom that we see in seasons 4, 5 and 6, and note the change from Branson to Tom, a very interesting example of the way in which names are used in the series to indicate class position. This Branson is significantly different from the Branson we see in seasons 1 through 3. Essentially, he becomes Mary's wingman, cheering her on in her various romance plotlines, of which there are many in the later seasons. And then a little conflict is introduced to the character of Sarah Bunting, who, as we've seen, reminds Tom of his political origins. At the end of season 5, Tom decides to go to Boston with his daughter, Sibby, and he doesn't appear in season 6. And then in the first Downton Abbey movie, as we've seen, he's extremely busy preventing attempted assassinations and other such things. But by the second film, he is happily married again to Lucy Smith, and this is when we get the leopards changing their spots line. So while you could look at the way that Tom outgrows his socialism and nationalism as an accurate depiction of what happens to some people as they get married or as they get older, or indeed as times change, which apparently they are changing, we're reminded of this fact a lot.
But things are changing.
The key thing to observe here is the way that his transformation is framed. It is unequivocally a success story. Tom's greatest achievement is in his 2 marriages, first to Sybil and then later to Lucy Smith. And his success consists not just in his assimilation into the Crawley family, but into the English estate. In a sense, Tom is legitimised by the institution of the English estate, by Downton Abbey. In season 6 of Downton Abbey, while Tom Branson is absent from the show because he's moved to Boston with his daughter Sibby, he writes a letter to Lady Mary Crawley. I dreamt last night that I was in the park at Downton, walking with Sibby under the great trees, listening to the pigeons cooing in the branches, and when I woke, my eyes were filled with tears.
Last night, I dreamt I went to Manderley again. It seemed to me I stood by the iron gate leading to the drive, and for a while I could not enter, for the way was barred to me.
So Downton Abbey, as a story that places the English estate front and centre, not only draws a lot of inspiration from shows like Upstairs, Downstairs, but also from the genre of the English estate novel. And this is a big tradition in English literature, ranging from novels such as Jane Austen's romances of the early 19th century to Agatha Christie's mysteries of the 20th century. And these works place great importance on the question of inheritance, often structuring their entire plots around it. The question of who will inherit the English estate becomes more complicated with the onset of modernity, because then another question is added. What will they inherit? We see novels like E.M. Forster's Howard's End, which was written in 1910, grappling with this question. We see that urbanisation is encroaching upon the English countryside. All the same, London's creeping. She pointed over the meadow, over 8 or 9 meadows, but at the end of them was a red rust. You see that in Surrey and even Hampshire now, she continued. I can see it from the Purbeck Downs, and London is only part of something else, I'm afraid. Life's going to be melted down, all over the world. Downton Abbey's inheritance plot is similarly a key aspect of the show. The events of the whole series are kicked off when Robert Crawley's heir, Patrick, dies on the Titanic. Mary Crawley was supposed to marry Patrick, and now that he is dead, the entail of the estate and her mother's dowry will not pass to Mary because she is female. And this plotline is partly resolved when Mary marries the new heir, Matthew Crawley. And after Matthew dies in season 4, a letter from him is found revealing that he intended Mary to be his sole heiress. So Mary is the one who will inherit Downton. And while her father grumbles a bit about this at first, having to share the estate with her, he ultimately comes around, because the Crawleys, on top of being really nice to their servants and not homophobic, are also fully in support of the 1920s upper class woman having it all. But I would argue that in the course of Downton Abbey, this inheritance plot is really just there to create some superficial drama. We never see any legitimate threat to Downton Abbey. In many of these other entries into the English estate genre of storytelling, particularly in the more recent ones, the estate is either compromised or destroyed at the end of the story. In Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca, 1938, Manderley is burned down at the end. At the end of Evelyn Waugh's Brideshead Revisited, which was written in 1945, Brideshead has been requisitioned by the English army. And the eponymous Howard's End survives at the end of the story, but crucially will be inherited by a child who is the offspring of both the upper classes and the working classes. What we can take away from all of these examples is that the English estate, at least in its original identity, is irreconcilable with the social and economic changes brought on by war and modernity. Contrast this with Downton Abbey. Yes, we do see the estate requisitioned as a convalescent hospital in season 2 during World War I, but following this, Downton Abbey is restored to its owners with very little status quo change. And in any case, the show zips through the First World War so quickly that there's no time to actually explore any of the implications of the estate being repurposed in this manner. In season 3, after the war, it emerges that Lord Grantham has run out of money, but luckily Matthew Crawley, the heir to the estate, also has an inheritance separate to his Downton inheritance, which he's able to invest in the estate, and the day is saved. And then later, in the travesty that is Downton Abbey, A New Era, we see that the Crawleys are forced to host a film crew on their estate because they need money to repair the leaks in their roof. But this is not really a legitimate threat. The leaks are just a plot contrivance to get a film crew at Downton. And they're not a sign really that Downton is crumbling. In fact, I think that if Downton were to crumble, the whole show would crumble, because the very same values that keep Downton standing are the values of the show. So what are these? Edward Said in Culture and Imperialism in 1992 talks about how the values of propriety, home and nation are encoded in the English estate. His analysis here was of Jane Austen's Mansfield Park. In the course of his essay on that novel, Said embarks on a post-colonial reading, showing how the slavery on the family's sugar plantation in the Caribbean is the source of wealth which keeps the estate of Mansfield Park running. For Said, the positive ideas of home and nation that are encoded in the English estate validate Jane Austen's world while devaluing other worlds. And Walter Rodney, in his book How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, which was written in 1972, shows how the active development of the colonial power is dependent on the active underdevelopment of the colonies from which that colonial power is deriving so much of their wealth. But we don't get an acknowledgement of this in Downton Abbey, of the bloody history of the English estate, of the fact that the Crawleys' wealth is almost certainly derived from these sources. Ireland as a British colony was also underdeveloped by British rule. And yet Tom Branson, as we've seen, just exists so that the show can now and then pay lip service to the general feeling in Ireland. And really, his role is to pipe down, to stop being so angry all the time, and to revise his prejudice against the English upper classes, because he should see people as people and not types. This focus on the individual, which we've already touched on earlier as being part of the ideology underpinning Downton Abbey as a show, is a symptom of postmodernism. And this association of postmodernism with individualism comes in part from that oft-quoted speech by the former Prime Minister of England, Margaret Thatcher, wherein Thatcher stated that there was no such thing as society, but rather individual men and women and their families. The Thatcherist ideology celebrated the free market while rejecting the ideas that had dominated British discourse immediately after the Second World War. Ideas that we could say were more socialist adjacent, with the creation of the National Health Service and with the welfare state. And one facet of Thatcherism that is very relevant to our discussion today is that of nostalgia.
But I was in search of love in those days, and I went full of curiosity and the faint, unrecognized apprehension that here at last I should find that low door in the wall others I knew had found before me.
So in the postmodern, post-imperial Britain of the 1980s, the immense popularity of something like Granada BBC's adaptation of Brideshead Revisited, which came out in 1981, was no coincidence. Brideshead Revisited falls into the category of what Andrew Hickson has described as the heritage film, a strand of contemporary British filmmaking that emerges from the nostalgia of postmodernism. And there was obviously an appetite for this nostalgia, for this longing for a lost Britain, a Britain that was seen as more noble, more cultured, more beautiful than the Britain of the 1980s. Brideshead Revisited was not only hugely successful in Britain, but also in the United States when it aired there a year later, to 5 million viewers weekly on PBS. And this massive overseas success, this exportation of British nostalgia, is something that we would see later with Downton Abbey as well. Many of these heritage films and dramas, therefore, aimed to sanitize Britain's past and to repackage this past as a commodity that could be sold overseas. And in the process of this sanitization, these heritage dramas would often undermine any more complex message that might have been in the original text. As Andrew Hickson writes, the nostalgic gaze of the heritage drama resists irony. And while Downton Abbey is not an adaptation but an original work, by comparing it to other similar escapist TV shows focusing on the upper classes, we can see how the show is actually quite remarkable for its lack of irony. When we look at the CW's Gossip Girl, which aired between 2007 and 2012, the original aim of this show was to satirize the elite of the Upper East Side of New York, although it quickly devolved into celebrating them instead. But this is in stark contrast to Downton Abbey, which from its very first episode plays things absolutely straight. Just look at how Lord Grantham, the embodiment of the English estate, is first introduced. And then you have something like Netflix's The Crown, which, while only marginally more subtle than Downton Abbey in its messaging...
The world has changed. Society in Britain has changed.
But things are changing.
Shows how the immensely privileged lifestyle of the royal family also works against those who wish to express themselves and make personal choices. Princess Margaret, for instance, is forbidden from marrying Peter Townsend, and rather than defying the royal family, ends up choosing her title and her wealth over him. And we see too how the whole Charles-Diana mess is in part precipitated by Prince Charles not being allowed to marry Camilla Shand. HBO's Succession then, which follows the family around Waystar Royco, a fictional multimedia conglomerate, is about as far away as you can get from Downton Abbey while still being a show about the upper classes. There is not a single likeable character among the immensely wealthy Roy family. They are all backstabbing, self-serving, cynical individuals. So there is nothing tragic or ironic about Downton Abbey's depiction of the English upper classes or its exploration of the English estate. And that is because it is absolutely drowning in nostalgia, even if this nostalgia is for something that never really existed in the first place. But this is also partly why the show became such a huge phenomenon on a global scale. Downton Abbey first aired in 2010 when the recession was in full swing, and this kind of entertainment that provided an escape from the lifestyles of the wealthy, as with the recession in the early 1980s, was evidently in demand. The royal wedding between the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge in 2011 also revived interest in the royal family of Britain, and more generally in Britain's elite. 17.6 million viewers in Britain alone tuned in to watch this event, with millions more worldwide. And this was also the era in which reality TV Bravo's Real Housewives series were at their height of popularity, and when the ridiculous lifestyles and petty dramas of the wealthy were on full display. And for many viewers, I'm sure that Downton Abbey fell into a similar category, a show that was to be enjoyed for its sumptuous costumes, its increasingly ridiculous plots, its lavish parties. It's just important to recognise that while one might watch Downton Abbey with this ironic lens, this irony is not present in the text of the show. The Crawleys are really nice, their house is really nice, and as the world around them gets more and more complicated, they only get nicer and nicer. But there's one key element of Downton Abbey's nostalgia which we haven't discussed yet, and that is nostalgia for domestic service. This is a bit of a difficult issue to discuss, because it's still rare to find TV shows and films that actually give any narrative focus to the help. So Downton Abbey is still the exception more than the rule when it comes to this. And I won't lie, in terms of Downton Abbey's servant storylines, there is some good stuff buried in there. The way that education transforms how Daisy Mason, the assistant cook, sees the world around her and the family she works for is incredibly interesting. And Thomas Barrow, while initially being a caricature of the gay, villainous footman that we already saw in Upstairs Downstairs, evolves into a three-dimensional character as the show progresses, so that eventually you're rooting for him and his happiness. And while I've already made my feelings on Sybil quite clear, the fact is that in season 1 she does help the housemaid Gwen to get a job as a secretary. We meet Gwen again in season 6 when she comes back to visit Downton with her husband, and the family initially don't recognise her until Thomas outs her. And this all leads to a very interesting moment. Indeed, I would say one of the rare moments where the show actually genuinely manages interesting class commentary.
You're jealous. Jealous. Because I dedicated my life to service, and I'm about to be thrown out on my ear when she scarpered first chance she got, and now she's lunching in the dining room. Why would that make me jealous, Mr. Bates?
Gwen, like Tom Branson, has escaped her circumstances mostly through an advantageous marriage, while those who stay in domestic service, like Thomas, those who remain loyal to their masters, are rewarded with nothing but more drudgery and uncertainty. But in general, while Downton Abbey does explore several storylines involving its servants, these storylines only ever play second fiddle to the main plotline of the show, which is to do with the lives, loves and scandals of the upper classes. Alongside the storylines involving the Crawleys, the servants are mainly used for comic relief or exposition. And while all the upstairs scenes were filmed in the interiors of Highclere Castle, the English stately home that plays Downton Abbey, the downstairs scenes were filmed in a different location. And I don't doubt that this was necessary for practical reasons, but I just find it quite funny. I think it's a good metaphor for the way that the servants' storylines are outsourced, essentially. They're just so clearly not the priority. So why are they there then, you have to ask? Why bother giving the servants any narrative focus at all? Well, I think part of it has to do with Downton Abbey wanting to be seen as a show that actually attempts some genuine historical and cultural class commentary. And part of it as well, I think, has to do with Downton Abbey's strange origins, which takes us back to Upstairs Downstairs. The creators of Upstairs Downstairs, Jean Marsh and Eileen Atkins, were friends who both came from working class backgrounds. And they came up with the idea for Upstairs Downstairs after watching a TV series called The Forsyte Saga, which chronicles the lives of a British upper middle class family at the start of the 20th century. We can see then that their priorities from this point were clear. Their show was to be about the servants, and the family upstairs were only added in later as a kind of afterthought. Now, whether Upstairs Downstairs stayed true to this original motivation throughout its run is another question entirely. But if we compare the pilot episodes of the two shows, Upstairs Downstairs and Downton Abbey, we can already see a huge difference in the way that these two shows depict domestic service. Both episodes open in the perspective of the servants. But where in Upstairs Downstairs you can practically feel how cold it is in the servants' quarters and how ridiculously early in the morning it is, how much work there is to do, in Downton Abbey the servants' routine is attractive and energising to look at. Everything is very clean and bright, and Downton just seems like a nice place to work. Where in Upstairs Downstairs we see how the housemaid Sarah is confused by the many arbitrary rules that she's confronted with, such as the necessity of entering the house through the servants' door rather than the front door, or the fact that she and the other housemaid Rose have to change their uniform in the middle of the day.
Oh, it's quite nice, isn't it? But why change?
Mornings were housemaids, afternoons were parlourmaids, see?
Oh.
Come on.
In Downton Abbey, any arbitrary rules that are attached to domestic service are just part of the charm of the place. Or else, when they're espoused by the butler, Mr. Carson, they're supposed to make the audience laugh at how stiff and upright he is. By contrast, Mr. Carson's equivalent in Upstairs Downstairs, the butler, Mr. Hudson, is very obviously playing a role. We see how he switches between a more proper English accent when he's talking to the master or laying down the law in front of his servants, and his native Scottish accent when he is more at ease or when he's allowed to be more human.
That's today's paper.
Burn it at once on the kitchen range, do you understand? Nobody must see it. Burn it!
And this sacrifice of personality required by domestic service is one of the aspects of the work that perhaps makes it most difficult. And this is one of the things we see Sarah struggling with in the first episode of Upstairs Downstairs. Her name isn't even Sarah. It's a name that Lord and Lady Bellamy decided to give her because it seemed more appropriate for a maid. In Sarah's eyes, the physical labour required by her new role is already hard enough. Why should she have to give up herself to it too? And then there's the paternalistic, restrictive morality exerted upon her and Rose by Mr. Hudson, making self-expression difficult even in off-duty times. This morality is present in Downton Abbey, but it's missing a key component: religion. In addition to being an incredibly progressive and pleasant place to work, Downton is also astoundingly secular. We don't see the servants made to say grace before meals, for instance, but we do see that in Upstairs Downstairs. And the difference between the 1970s and the 2010s here in terms of the advance of secularism is very clear to see. And this is just another example of Downton Abbey's postmodern preoccupations. Preoccupations which completely undermine its attempts at historical accuracy and genuine class commentary. Because religion would have been a key component of morality back then, and the servants would have had to say grace before their meals. So again, if we relate Downton's success back to, in part, the historical context of the recession and people's need for an escape, its rather romantic depiction of domestic service can be seen as part of this. Again, we see this nostalgia for something that really didn't exist. For a pleasant workplace, decent employers, colleagues that are more like family than anything else. And finally then, we have the fact of perspective. In Upstairs Downstairs, we stay in the servant's perspective for the duration of the pilot episode. In Downton Abbey, after this energising opening scene, the perspective switches to the real main characters of the show, the Crawleys. So, as we've seen, Jean Marsh and Eileen Atkins came up with the idea for Upstairs Downstairs by looking at a TV show about the English upper classes and thinking, well, what about the servants? But Gareth Neame and Julian Fellows apparently looked at Upstairs Downstairs and asked themselves, but what about the family? It's quite a strange trajectory, which I think in part explains the kind of strange space occupied by the servant characters in Downton Abbey. The creators feel that the servants should be included, but they're not really interested in telling a story about working class characters. Perhaps this is because the experience of the working class, even in a utopic world like Downton Abbey, is still seen as too miserable, too dull to really make for a good story. Downton Abbey is, at its heart, a celebration of the English upper classes. Even as it may attempt from time to time to assume the air of a tragedy, it is a tale of triumph. We see the Crawleys triumph again and again over modernity, because they are ultimately flexible. Lord Grantham gets a little grumpy when his daughter wants to marry the Irish chauffeur, but he eventually comes around. Even the Dowager Countess, who disapproves of electricity and motor cars, is not so easily shocked by the more concrete changes occurring around her. Whether it comes to her granddaughter Mary's scandalous sex life or the kitchen maid Daisy Mason getting an education, Violet greets every new obstacle with humour and ultimately tolerance. She isn't even shocked when hearing that Tom Branson has participated in the burning of Drumgool, the fictional Anglo-Irish house, because, in her view, the house was an eyesore. So when the very real suffering and pain of working class people, of Irish people, does come up, the solutions that the show provides to these questions are just laughable. Working class people should just do their best to marry well, and maybe if they try really hard, they can eventually be accepted by the elite. Just look at Branson and how far he's come. And on that subject, socialists should remember that upper class people have feelings too. And if the Irish could only accept that we do care about their plight, even though we're the ones who caused it, even though we are only sitting here comfortable in our mansion right now because of the suffering that we have put them and other colonized people through, maybe they would stop being so angry all the time. I don't know about you, but I am so ready for an English period drama that actually foregrounds the experience of working class people, that deals with the legacy of colonialism, with the Irish national question. And if you've stuck around this long, I don't think you'll be surprised when I say that Downton Abbey is not one of them. Thank you so much for watching, and please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. And I intend to make many more videos examining Irish depictions in media, so if you have any suggestions, do leave them in the comments below. I'm also on TikTok for my sins. I still don't fully understand it, but I'm on it nonetheless. You'll see a link in the description to my profile if you're interested in checking that out. So until next time, slán!